So this is Hári. Hári Sewell is founding director of Health HS Consultancy UK, which specialises in mental health and social care, social injustice and equalities. A qualified social worker by background, he's held senior posts in mental health and social care in the health sector, local authorities and central government. He's worked in the field of equalities and mental health nationally and internationally. There you go, Hári, take it away.
Okay, great, thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here with everyone, and I just want to get into my presentation straight away. Great. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here because, of course, the subject of racism in psychiatry, in mental health, is very topical, as we're aware. The incidents internationally, which has kind of led into protests around the world, have really placed centrally our questions about how racism affects us in all walks of life. So I guess the main thing is to recognize that every year we look at our data on inequalities for people from racialized minorities in psychiatry. And we kind of have this surprise. I can imagine boards and senior management teams around the country, asking their information people, oh, give us the data. They look at the data and they go, oh my goodness, look, we've still got these inequalities. And I think, well, yeah, we've known this for 40 years. We've known it internationally, and we still seem to be surprised by it. And there's a quote from a guy called Don Berwick, who's the former president and chief exec of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in America. He then kind of went on to be quite a bigwig as an advisor to governments, the Blair Brown administration here, Cameron administration, and administrations in Canada and Australia, I believe. So he's kind of a big guy, and he says the outcomes you get from any system are precisely the outcomes the system is designed to give you. And for me, this is the starting point, because we keep looking for solutions in interventions. We look for solutions in tweaking some of the policies within psychiatry. But actually, if we get persistent outcomes that show the inequalities that we're going to look at in a minute, it must indicate that there is something about the design of the system that makes it inevitable that we get those kind of outcomes. Here's some data that's taken from the central government facts on mental health. And it doesn't really take a lot of scrutiny to see, in terms of the detention rates, that if you look at the black column, and if you see there, the key there is we're looking at the darker figures being the 2018-19 data, and the lighter ones are the previous year's data. And not only are you seeing that things are getting worse in terms of per 100,000, but the variation between black and white is significant. Again, the same is true of the Asian group. And these kind of patterns have been well known, as I've indicated before. On this slide, I'm not going to take you through every single line, but just to kind of give you an indication of some of the variations that we've known about for half a century or more now. We know, for example, that in terms of detention rates, you've kind of seen on the previous slide about the increased likelihood that people who are black and brown are going to be detained. And of course, being detained in and of itself is not the only problem. That has a massive impact on your opportunities, your ability to travel to different countries, your relationships with people around you, the kinds of work you might be able to do. So it isn't just the negative experience for many. I know not for everyone, but for many, it's not just the negative experience of being detained, but it's the consequences on your life going forward. So the detention rates being as they are, the kind of variations are a significant concern. In forensic services, we recognize that black and brown people's admissions to low and medium secure are significantly higher, 5 times their numbers in the general population. The issue around community treatment orders, for those of you who might not be that familiar with the different types of interventions and treatment methodologies in mental health and psychiatry, it's an order that means that people can be discharged from hospital, but the right of the system exists for those people to be reclaimed and taken back into hospital. And when these orders were first being discussed, they were spoken about as being like a long leash that you could kind of feel as though you had freedoms in the community, but that could be taken away from you at any time. And the data has been pretty persistent since the implementation of community treatment orders, that Black communities are 8 times more likely to be placed on community treatment orders compared with their white counterparts. Look at the diagnosis for psychosis. Data shows that diagnosis rates are 3.2% for Black men compared with 0.3% for white men. I mean, these variations, I could go on and on. These variations are significant. So as we begin to explore this question about racism in psychiatry, I realize that for many people, the question is, well, is it just unconscious bias? Are there other forces at work? Is it legitimate to focus on what happens in psychiatry because perhaps the problems that we're seeing are things that have happened further upstream? At this point, and it's something I shall repeat, we have to ask the question about a proportionate response. If we have known these data sets for 40, 50 years, and there has been a lack of appropriate response, can we legitimately say that there is no evidence of an institutional form of racism? If we recognize that there is a greater burden amongst a certain aspect of our community, a certain demographic, and we don't take an appropriate response to that, can we legitimately ask the question? Well, we can ask the question, but could we end up concluding that there is no institutional racism in psychiatry? On this slide, I'm kind of dealing with a question around the experience of young people and the experience of adult men and adults in psychiatry. So on the left, that pie chart is basically illustrating to us that people from racialized minority backgrounds in children's mental health services, CAMS, are underrepresented. So to talk just about one group, young boys, Black boys, are underrepresented in child and adolescent mental health services. But by the time they reach adult mental health services, we see this significant overrepresentation that I touched on in the previous 2 slides. Why might that be? Is there something that suddenly happens physiologically? If we go down a neuroscientific or biological route, is there something that means that as young people, a high rate of mental health problems for Black and brown children isn't really an issue, but mysteriously by the time they reach 18, this thing suddenly combusts in their brains? Or there could be another way of looking at this. Could it be that as a world, depending on who's in front of us, we see or hear something different? And could it well be that for young children with emotional distress and trauma, if you're Black and brown, that might be perceived as being deviance, as being something that you pick up in the criminal justice system. So if you see young Black boys getting involved in gangs or some kind of behaviors that teachers might find difficult to manage, it could well be, and this is a hypothesis that not just I share, that maybe teachers don't see emotional distress, they see behavioral problems. So things get picked up in that route. So whereas other young people may get therapeutic services involved to support them, young Black boys may well become diverted into the criminal justice system or some kind of corrective programs as opposed to the support. And then, unsurprisingly, if those issues are not attended to, you see the overrepresentation in later adulthood. So we asked this question about race and racism, and I'm going to talk about different kinds of racism. But I guess it's worth us going right back to basics to say, well, when we talk about race, what is it? So here's a legal definition. According to the Equality Act 2010, race can include color. Race can also include nationality and ethnicity and national origins. So if we share the same kind of cluster of these things, we can be considered to belong to the same racial group. And you can kind of get two or more groups combining to become a joint racial group like Black, Asian. According to the law, that's what we mean when we talk about race. Makes it pretty hard to define exactly what we're talking about, which it might make you question the taxonomy. How have we gathered a set of criteria that we use to determine who belongs to which racial group or not? So I said, let's go back to basics. For those of you who don't know, we've all got 25,000 genes, and the largest difference between any two individuals is less than 1%. As human beings, we're actually basically similar, massively so. And it's also true that the heterogeneity, the difference that you might find genetically, is often larger across what we consider to be racial groups. Is larger within racial groups than across what we consider to be racial groups. So we think of races as being biologically distinct groups of people where there is this kind of commonality genetically, and the genetic variation across groups is often larger. Adam Rutherford had a book published this year called How to Argue with a Racist, and he's a geneticist and takes us on this journey of looking in quite a detailed way at the genetics of humans and then kind of applies that to our understanding of race. So most people who ideologically believe in race and therefore in racism buy into this notion that there are distinct groups of people who can be divided by genetics, and which is a sign for racial differences. But here's a quote from this very bright geneticist's volume. It says, all of the attempts over centuries to place humans into distinct races, of all of them, none succeeds. Genetics refuses to comply with these artificial and superficial categories. Skin color, whilst being the most obvious difference between people, is a very bad proxy for the total amount of similarity or difference between individuals and populations. Racial differences are skin deep. Genetically speaking, it doesn't hold water. Observationally, it does, yeah, what we see. How many races are there? Well, Caucasian, if you kind of think about a phrase that would be used in America, wasn't really used before the 1940s. Hispanic is a term that is used in the United States, only been in use since 1970. In much of the research in psychiatry and the criminal justice system and in all walks of life in America, Hispanics are considered to be a racial group. Mysteriously, we don't have that as a racial group in this country. As I said, there's no consensus. You look at South Africa, you'll see that there's a distinction between whites, Asians, blacks, and coloreds, supposedly as racial groups, not a set of categorizations we have in the UK. And it's been well known that these categorizations change over time, as I've indicated. So once you begin to explore this arena, you realize that we talk about race, A, as if it's permanent and fixed, and B, as if we all know what we're talking about. And the reality is, this is not true. However, the process of racialization is very clear, that certain groups are considered to have a race and that there are a set of attributes that are associated with those racial groups. And something develops called valence. So social psychologists say when two categories can be linked to each other by shared goodness or badness, the shared property is called valence or emotional valence. And the reason for me citing that is because largely what we see is a belief that race exists, a belief that there are these distinct groups, and then a feeling that there are a set of attributes that sit more with certain racial groups. And that valence is shared by all of us, or most of us in society. So when we think about racism in psychiatry, we might not necessarily be thinking about explicit and overt forms of racism, but what we might be seeing is this underlying belief about race. So I'll illustrate my point. Look at this slide. If you search for race and anything, race has come to denote being black or being other, as if race is something that only black people have. So people might say, oh, I don't care whether you're black, blue, purple or brown, we'll work with you. You know, I don't mind if you date my family member. I don't care if they're black, purple and brown. It just depends on, you know, whether they treat you right. As if what we're talking about is skin color. But actually, race is a cipher for a whole other set of attributes. We say race as a shorthand to indicate a common belief system about a group of people that aren't biologically distinct, but that we observe them and assume they carry a certain set of traits. So this test that I'm going through is to say, if you go into Google or any search engine and type race and, you can do race and stop and search, race in the criminal justice system, race in education. What you see are a set of returns that indicate that as a world population, when we think of race, we think of deficient. So that black, purple, brown or blue, that almost implies that we look across all races and see them on a par, is told to be a lie when we do this kind of search that I've just done. Look at tasers, you see the same kind of thing. You look at race in society and you see issues of race being a problem. So the first problem we have when we're exploring this issue of race in psychiatry is the concept of race itself. And then the desire for us, many of us, to separate out the idea from race, of race from racism, because that can't really be done. So you see it in employment. So the thing that we should really be focusing on isn't race so much as the process of racialization. As an example, we'll often say people experience negative outcomes because they are black or because they are Asian. And that is a misattribution of cause. There's nothing intrinsic about black people that means that they're more likely to be placed on CTOs. There's nothing intrinsic about black people that means they're more likely to be diagnosed with psychosis or to have longer lengths of stay in our psychiatric wards. The cause isn't because they are black. The cause is the consequence of racism. So we short circuit our processes by avoiding naming racism and attributing cause to the people. And that is the process of racialization, is that we create the sense of other with the valence that I've already touched on. So anti-racism gets played out like this. One either endorses the idea of a racial hierarchy as racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes the problem is rooted in groups of people as a racist, that would be a view, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies. And that's what you do as an anti-racist. So this is from Ibram X. Kendi's book of 2019, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Have a real good look and read of that slide, which I've just read for you, and also check out his book, because we're already moving into this arena of recognizing that there is no place for neutrality. Okay, so what kind of racisms? The title of this presentation was gonna kind of help us think about them. And, you know, we don't have long, if we had a day course or a week course, we could kind of get into them. But what I'm gonna do here is to kind of throw out some questions or some types of racisms, and we can start to, in the back of our mind, question whether or not we recognize any of these in psychiatry. The first is overt ideologically based racism. We're all familiar with that. You know, the EDL the people who protested against the Black Lives Matter protests are overtly, clearly racist, based on an ideology that the world can be divided up into populations and that white people are superior. What's also important to know, though, is that the ideology that people might hold in that similar way might be expressed covertly, because we often think about racists as being people who ideologically believe in white supremacy and that therefore they show their true colors. But recently, with the Windrush scandal, and we look at some of the documents that emerged from central government, and we see the very clear articulation of a belief that it was okay for there to be European migration into England, into Britain, and for people to intermarry and become part of our societies. But and the government stated explicitly that they really did not want to see the integration of Black and brown people into British society. But that was never spoken explicitly. So the ideology was there, but they used covert methods to try and achieve that end, as we saw with the Windrush scandal. So you can get the ideology, but it still comes out in covert ways. Then you get forms of racism that are about the intersections between our environmental policies, for example, and capitalism, which again, we don't have enough time, but you'll be aware that the COVID-19 experience has really shone a light on the impact of where we might say we live in a meritocracy, that there are policies and approaches that mean that always there are going to be certain groups of people, not for biological reasons, but for systemic reasons, like the impact of capitalism, certain groups of people are going to be disadvantaged. Then there's institutional racism. Many of us are familiar with that. We're going to come back to that. There's the non-racist type of racism, where you kind of just think it's really, really awful. It's bad, but we should just love each other, hold hands, and put up memes on our Facebook with two kids, one black, one white, cuddling each other and say, oh, that's so sweet. This is what we need, is a lot of love, as if like this is what's going to solve it. That non-racist kind of racism is there. Then you've got acquiescent racism, where people kind of just give up, kind of think, yeah, it's all too tough. My life's hard enough as it is. And, I've got my problems to deal with. It is really pretty poo, but, it just is the way it is. And there must be a reason why it is. And that's kind of acquiescent racism. Again, the question is, do we see any of this in psychiatry? Then there's non-validation. And some of you will have read my work around toxic interaction theory. Non-validation is a type of racism that doesn't really believe that it's as bad as it is. Like an all lives matter approach stems from this place that can't really believe that the experience of Black and brown people is actually as bad as it is. You might have seen it when the protest began in the UK, and many people are saying, well, yeah, I don't know what the protests are about. It's not like America, is it? We don't really have that kind of racism here. And one tends to roll one's eyes and think, well, okay, so you just don't think it's that bad. We don't have all day to hear my anecdotes, but it is that bad. Then we get unconscious forms of bias, where people internalize those dominant narratives, those dominant ideas about Black and brown people without even realizing it, like the value placed on life, or the way in which migration is spoken about, that people come to believe the dominant narrative of politicians and policymakers and the media about what migration means for us, without ever investing in critiquing it, without ever knowing that actually, if we didn't have migrants when COVID-19 hit, the NHS would have collapsed, literally, and like a whole load more people have died. But that story isn't really told with a fanfare. The story that's told are the few people who might be on benefits, who are also immigrants. So unconscious bias is about the way in which that stuff seeps in without people being aware of it. So taking it back to mental health, taking it back to psychiatry, here's a quote that I often use. At some level, psychiatry, and when I talk about psychiatry, I'm not just talking about psychiatrists, the discipline. At some level, psychiatry, politicians, and policymakers believe that there is something biologically and culturally determined behind the gross variations in the data that we've just been looking at. The evidence for me saying that is, if we really thought that those variations, those overrepresentations that we've looked at in the stats, and there's many more, if we really thought that they were as a consequence of people's lived experience of racism as a discipline, we would be standing up and shouting from the rooftops. We would be saying, look, if you look at it purely from a financial perspective, we're spending a lot of money on mental services for a group of people because of the racism in society. We do that with alcohol. We do that with taking substances. There are many things we say as a psychiatric system. We have evidence that there are things that happen in society that mean that certain groups of people are more likely to end up in our services. And for moral, ethical, and financial reasons, we believe we need to speak out against those social inequalities. But the voice in psychiatry that speaks out against racism, I'm not saying it's not there, but it's not proportionate to the level of variations that we see. And then it kind of leads me to this question. Maybe at some level we think, well, it's something about these group of people, which links back to that slide from Kendi that I put up before, which is we look at the people for the answers. What's wrong with them, as opposed to looking at the policies and looking at what we are doing as a system. So I know I'm running out of time. Unconscious bias is really just this idea that there are things that inform our decision-making that we're completely unaware of. The problem with this as an approach is that it continues to locate the challenge within the minds, within the psychology of individual practitioners within our service, and still tries to circumnavigate the fact that there are things built in to psychiatry. There's the systemic dimension that is worth exploring. But before I talk about institutional racism, I do have to quickly give you some background, which is, of course, that the term has been popularized by Macpherson, a white middle-class man in the UK, following the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And the two people who coined the phrase, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, actually coined the term institutional racism in their book Black Power, which I have, in 1967. And there is just something paradoxical, isn't there? That two African-American men coin a phrase, institutional racism, and then the person who gets the glory for it is a white middle-class barrister in the UK. That tells you something. We're talking about institutional racism, and institutional racism is built into the term institutional racism. I spoke about intersection oppressions. We don't have time to kind of go into that in detail. But Macpherson, his definition, the one that has been popularized, is 55 words. And I've kind of slimmed it down into these three elements: collective failures of a system, unwitting behaviors, and poorer outcomes. They're the key elements that you'll have if you're going to see institutional racism. And this could be related to any form of discrimination. If you get this in your mind, it's well worth recognizing that even though individuals working within the system might be unwitting in what they do, because they're shared, policies and practices are just carried on and passported, and you see it in the data. And the thing is, every year we see the poor outcomes of Black and brown people in our mental health data. And there is insufficient attention paid to what are the collective failures within our system, either as individuals in terms of unwitting behaviors, or us as a collective. And the fact that we pay insufficient attention to that indicates that there is institutional racism in our system. The problem with the word racist is that nobody wants to say we are a racist. I'm going to jump over a couple of slides just to kind of get to the end. So if you want to explore whether or not racism exists in psychiatry, you can ask this question: does education in psychiatry point out the racism that has been built into the history, both recent and past history of the discipline? Do we talk about that routinely? Sorry, that slide. Whoops, I can't, right, sorry, that jumped. Yeah, so that's the first point. Do we check out the education so that as practitioners, not as psychiatrists only, but in the discipline, do we spend a lot of time understanding how racism is borne out in psychiatry? And I know Suman's going to talk about this a bit more, so I won't delve into it. So that's a checklist. Is there racism? Do we do this sufficiently well? I don't think so. You can kind of turn to your own answers for that. Second question, does policy centralize the impacts of racism as a causal factor? So I've already said, we've got these gross variations in data. Does policy say, look, as providers of mental health services, it's really going to be important that we take account of that racism in every single intervention and understand that as a causal factor? If we don't see that centralized in policy routinely, and then for there to be funds and technologies to support that, you might conclude also that that's an indication that there is racism in our system, because it's a denial of the reality of people's racism. If the system keeps telling you it's not as bad as you think it is, that's a form of racism. Then the third and final checklist point is, do practitioners in psychiatry, whether the psychiatrists or other disciplines, centralize the impacts of racism in their treatment and approach? When we're working with people, do we kind of think, oh, you're ill and the racism must be really bad too? Because if that's the approach, that's an indication that there is racism in our discipline. So what next? Well, I guess it's going to be the opposite of what I've just said. We need to, at the practice level, be looking at people we're working with, understand their identity, and to get into some exploration of how does my knowledge of this aspect of this person's identity influence what I'm doing here and now. For it to not, and some practitioners will still say, I feel really proud, race doesn't come into it. In 2019, I've heard that, isn't our goal is to not see someone's race or ethnicity? The answer to that is no. If you think that up to this point, please understand that if you do that, effectively what you're saying is, I'm going to pretend that those inequalities that people face in their lives don't really exist, because you're saying, I'm going to pretend that I don't see that difference. So that's what we might be able to do at practice level. Then there's a whole range of things that will emerge from actually centralizing our awareness of the impact of racism on people's lives. What about in policy? Firstly, the assumption about what is normal. Understand that psychiatry, its history, is built around an idea of what normal is, and that is racialized. And we need to then get our education within mental health and psychiatry to expose that reality, that our system is built on an idea of normal that is basically a white Western idea of normal. We also, in policy terms, need to move away from policies that are not biased and to policies that actively tackle racism. And we also need, as I said previously, for our policies to recognize the imprint of racism in the present. So that's it for me.
Harry, that was...
I know there were comments coming in, but I wanted to focus on the presentation, so I'm kind of...
Absolutely. Harry, that was a brilliant introduction, really taking us through kind of the whole history of exactly how this has come about, and taking us through some really important points there. Harry, this is from Felicia Lazaridou. Is there a way to study the impact of racism within the Black community without suggesting that the community itself is at fault?
So are these questions to me to respond to?
Yes, yeah,
absolutely. So there's a lot of exploration now about moving away from the struggle narrative. And in a way, there are kind of two distinct aspects. One is, what the Black community itself does in terms of its own narrative. But there's also what I referred to earlier on about the misattribution of cause, that the more we can talk about the real cause as being racism and not something intrinsic about the group of people, then the conversation changes. So it moves away from talking about Black deficiency and it starts to talk about whiteness. But once you get into that, we get into the uncomfortable territory of talking about white supremacy, a phrase that alarms people because they think of the Ku Klux Klan, or white privilege, that unnerves people because many people interpret that to mean that every white person has a whole load of privilege. But I think it's worth starting those conversations, becoming accustomed to talking about white supremacy, white privilege, and talking about decolonizing things that historically are presented as positive, even though it's positive at the expense of Black and brown people. They're the conversations, I think, that will shift the narrative. But just by telling our kids, well, yeah, you know, we've got rocket scientists and, you know, teachers and doctors and lawyers who are Black, I don't think that alone will shift the narrative. We need to go right back to source. The source is the process of racialization and of white supremacy.
And there's this interesting kind of element of society now that it's almost become more offensive to call somebody a racist than it is to experience racism itself. That seems to be something that I've seen experience. I have another question here from Katrina Carberry. She says, is it fair to start from a position that we are a racist society and this is something that white people need to understand?
Yes, so yeah, absolutely. I think one of the problems with the concept of racism, and that's why I explore the different types of racism, is that to be called a racist, as you rightly said, Will, is almost the worst thing ever. And we think of racism as a way of being, as opposed to a set of actions. So in How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi that I referred to, you know, he kind of makes that point so many times in that book, that, you know, racism isn't about who we are. Racism are things that we do, and that Black and brown people do racist things as much as white people do. Not as much as, they also do, but it's something that moves around. So if we can kind of understand that, I think that would be a way into that arena. So, you know, to kind of recognize, yes, we are racist as a society, owning that, and for the conversation to be okay. Right now, everyone gets like really anxious once you refer to racism.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully, obviously, there's been very tragic events of late, but this it has facilitated the conversation, and really keen for that to carry on. I'm just going to ask you one last question, Harry, before we move on to Alison's presentation. This is from Dee Sharma from Sheffield. She says, thank you so much, Harry. I particularly liked you addressing the focus on genetics to try and overshadow where the inequalities really stem from. What can mental health nurses do proactively on the front line, apart from campaigning and raising awareness?
Okay, great. Thanks for mentioning campaigning and raising awareness, because ultimately that's what's going to change things. But in terms of practice, literally centralizing that recognition that Black and brown people have had a different set of experiences, and that is likely to have been a causal factor in why they are where they're at, is the big game changer. And it doesn't mean that every single individual will say, I've experienced racism of the overt nature. It's not that. It's recognizing that to live in a racist society is in itself toxic. And then you've got all the socioeconomic inequalities that are likely to have an influence on people's lives. So to not take account of that is not only racist, but it's also not attending to the things that are causal factors. But we often, when we say, oh, let's address racism in a person's life, we're looking for, you know, the cases when neighbors put poo through the letterbox and they got sacked from a job and someone called them a racist name. That isn't how racism gets played out routinely in 2020. And we need to become sophisticated as frontline practitioners to understand how racism actually does get played out through microaggressions and, you know, through the kind of systemic burdens that I spoke about, and to take account of that in practice. That's the game changer.